My wife had been working with her close friend for several years. Their office was a mode-sized company and the two of them shared many stories about the long hours and tedious tasks they had to endure despite the challenges they seemed to have found some kind of rhythm in their work. I'd hear bits and pieces over dinner how they'd handle difficult clients or cover for each other when one was overwhelmed. It sounded exhausting, but they managed. Meanwhile, my job in it offered me the flexibility to work from home or head into the office as I pleased. It was a comfortable arrangement, and I had no reason to complain. But things began to change when their company brought in a new manager. This new boss, from what I gathered, had a reputation for being a micromanager. The workload doubled overnight. My wife and her friends started coming home later and looking visibly worn out. At first, I figured it was just the adjustment period of a new reg, something they'd get used to. But as weeks turned into months, the strain only grew. My wife spoke less about her day, which wasn't like her. Usually she vented about something funny or annoying that had happened at work. Now there was only silence or short answers. It was clear the new management style was taking a toll on her. One evening, she mentioned how meetings had become endless lectures about productivity and efficiency. The deadline lines were tighter and the expectations were set unrealistically high. What made it worse was the boss's complete lack of interest in the actual well-being of his team. Morale in the office plummeted. My wife's friend, who was usually upbeat and encouraging, started talking about leaving altogether. I could see where this was heading, but I chose not to push. I've always believed in handling problems with a clear head, not by making hasty decisions. Things reached a breaking point when my wife came home one night, visibly upset. She'd been given an impossible deadline, and when she tried to explain why it couldn't be done, the boss dismissed her concerns outright. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but this time it seemed to cut deeper. She was frustrated not just with the situation, but with the lack of respect she felt from her superiors. I told her she'd done everything she could and that some people just don't value effort. She nodded, but I could tell she'd already made up her mind about what needed to be done. The next day, she and her friend Saturday down together during lunch and made a decision. They'd had enough. The two of them agreed it was time to quit. It wasn't an impulsive choice. They'd been talking about this possibility for weeks. They listed the pros and cons, weighed their options, and came to the conclusion that staying wasn't worth their health or sanity. I respected their decision. No job is worth sacrificing your well-being for, and I trusted my wife's judgment when she told me about it. That evening, she seemed more at peace than she had in weeks. She explained how they both decided to hand in their resignations together, making a firm stand. I asked if they discussed it with anyone at the company, and she said they had. Their boss was surprised, even offering to raise their salaries and improve working conditions. But my wife wasn't interested. She lost all faith in the place, and no amount of money was going to change that. Her friend felt the same. It hadn't even been a week since my wife and her friend quit their jobs when her friend landed a new position. It didn't come as a complete surprise. Her friend had always been resourceful and quick on her feet. She'd managed to secure a job at a company where she seemed to fit right in, and from what I'd heard, she was already making progress there. My wife, on the other hand, was still in the process of figuring out her next move. She wasn't the type to rush into things without considering her options, and I respected that about her. But it was clear she was feeling the pressure to find something soon. One evening, she brought up a conversation she'd had with her friend. Apparently the friend had spoken to someone at her new job about helping my wife get a foot in the door. This wasn't going to be a traditional interview, though. My wife explained that her friend's position that the company had been secured through connections, and she'd advanced rapidly in just a week. It was all very informal, almost like the kind of thing you'd see in old business dramas where deals were made over dinner. I listened carefully as she laid out the details. Her friend had suggested that the two of them host a small gathering at our home to meet with a key contact from the company. It sounded unusual to me. I asked why they couldn't just meet at an office or even a neutral location like a cafe. My wife explained that her friend believed these kinds of informal settings were more effective. Apparently that's how her friend had gotten her own job, and it seemed to work well enough. This is just how things are done sometimes, she said, clearly trying to convince both me and herself that this was the right approach. I'll admit I had my reservations. Hosting strangers in our home for something as significant as a job interview felt a bit odd. I brought up the idea of taking them to a nice restaurant. Instead, it seemed like a more neutral ground and a lot less personal, but my wife quickly dismissed the suggestion. She said her friend was adamant that the setting needed to be relaxed and comfortable. Hosting the meeting at home would give off that impression of hospitality and trust qualities her friend thought would work. In her favor, all right, I said, finally giving in. If you think this is the best way to do it, we'll do it your way. She smiled, visibly relieved. I could tell she'd been worried about how I'd react to that idea, and hearing my approval seemed to ease some of that tension. It wasn't an ideal situation from my perspective, but I trusted her judgment enough to go along with it. After all, she knew her friend and the circumstances better than I did. With the decision made, we started discussing how to prepare for the meeting. My wife mentioned that she'd handle most of the arrangements, but she'd need my help with a few things. She wanted everything to be perfect, from the food to the overall atmosphere. It was clear she was taking this very seriously. I agreed to pitch in where needed, though I made it clear that I expected her to take the lead on the details. This was her project, and I wanted her to have ownership of it. The day of the informal meeting arrived, and I made sure everything was prepared to the highest standard. If we were going to house strangers in our home, I wanted to leave a good impression. I went out early that morning to buy the best cuts of meat I could find. The butcher even recommended a particular seasoning blend, which I